More than 3.5 million personnel served with the United States Navy during the Second World War, aboard thousands of ships all over the world. Each ship and each crew had its own story during the war, and they all faced risks, as the 62,614 officers and sailors of the Navy who died during the war can attest. 115 of those served aboard a unique vessel. The USS St Augustine was not originally built for war, and her loss would represent the everyday risks faced by those who served. It is history that deserves to be remembered. George Fisher Baker, Jr. was a banker and a financier, a chairman of the First National Bank of New York. He sat on the board of some of the largest corporations in the nation: General Electric, United States Steel, Atlantic Telephone and Telegraph, General Motors, Pullman, the New York Central Railroad, and the Consolidated Gas Company of New York. A 1937 article by the Associated Press described him as a medium-sized man with thin black hair, spectacles, and smooth-shaven, and said that he was very shy of public attention. Baker Jr. was the son of George Fisher Baker Sr., a financier of the Gilded Age. A president of the First National Bank of New York, the senior Baker was often referred to as the Dean of American banking. The New York Times said of him that he helped to lay the groundwork for modern industrial America. He was also, at one time, considered to be the third richest man in the United States, after Henry Ford and John D. Rockefeller. Thus, when George F. Baker, Jr. died in 1937, he was, the AP wrote, worth untold millions. Baker died suddenly at age 59 of peritonitis in Honolulu, Hawaii, aboard his yacht, the Viking. When I say his yacht, understand that this was the custom yacht of reputedly one of the world's richest men. The Viking was built in 1929 at the Newport News Shipping and Dry Dock Company for a price described as well over $1 million. It was built under the supervision of New York-based naval architect Theodore D. Wells, who had designed some of the most famous yachts of the era and who would later work for the Naval Department. The Viking was everything you'd expect of a yacht built custom for one of the world's richest men. A twin-screw, steel-hulled steam vessel at 272 foot 2 inches long, Viking was described as one of the largest of the American yachting fleet and as the first turbo-electric drive yacht to be built. After Baker's untimely death, the yacht was purchased by another multimillionaire, Norman B. Woolworth of the Five and Dime Store family. Woolworth renamed the yacht Naparro, playing the names of he and his children. It was, among the yachting crowd, a famous vessel, described as palatial, and according to the Vancouver Sun, one of the most beautiful vessels ever seen in the port of Vancouver. It was an extraordinary vessel, and unique. It had no sisters, the only one of its kind. It represented the lives of the world's most wealthy and elite, a ship of elegance and beauty, if also of extravagance. It was not, however, built as a ship of war. But things change. By 1940, it was clear that the war was on the horizon and that the United States Navy needed to grow. The 1940 Naval Appropriations Act sought to increase the size of the fleet by 1,325,000 tons. Among the provisions of the Act, the President of the United States was authorized to acquire and convert, or to undertake the construction of 100,000 tons of auxiliary vessels of such size, type, and design as he may consider best suited for the purposes of national defense. Retired U.S. Navy Captain Richard T. Miller writes in the U.S. Naval Institute Press in 1999, in 1940, as evidence mounted that the United States would become involved in World War II, Navy planners began to remedy the lack of brown water, green water, and short seas vessels. Suitable yachts were purchased by the dozens for conversion to patrol craft. While many yachts were acquired at the patriotic sum of just $5, Woolworth asked a tad more for the Naparro. Originally built at the cost of well over $1 million, on December 5, 1940, Naparro was sold to the United States Navy for $180,000. The paper Boating World explains the transition from luxury yacht to naval warship. The Naparro, moored at the Thames Shipyard in New London, Connecticut, would be transferred to Boston for conversion. After the Naparro was converted to a gunboat at the Bethlehem Steel Corporation Yard in Boston, Massachusetts, she received her new designation as PG, meaning Patrol Gunboat, 54. Her luxury appointments removed, she was armed with 3 3-inch guns, 4 50-caliber machine guns, and was equipped with 2 depth charge racks to combat enemy U-boats. In 1939, Harold Coley, president of the Florida State Chamber of Commerce, proposed that a new U.S. Navy cruiser be named for the Florida city of St. Augustine. the oldest continually inhabited European established settlement in the United States. However, all the cruisers under construction had already been named. On the 9th of January, 1941, the newly converted luxury yacht was officially renamed USS St Augustine. The boat was commissioned on the 16th and assigned to the 1st Naval District, patrolling from the port of Boston until 1942, when she was transferred to the eastern sea frontier, for which she escorted convoys between New York and various Caribbean ports. The Nashville, Indiana Brown County Democrat wrote in 2022, "The eastern sea frontier was the designated duty area for the St. Augustine, which encompassed the eastern coast of the United States and the Caribbean Sea. During World War II, it was very much a part of the Battle of the Atlantic, the longest battle of the war from 1939 to 1945. She would once again be visiting familiar waters along the eastern seaboard, as well as tropical climes in the Caribbean, but now featuring an array of deadly weaponry and a crew approaching 150 sailors and officers, rather than the 23 individuals that had catered to all the wishes of the Woolworth family." As the war went on, the Navy expanded, and the U-boat menace was greatly reduced. The St. Augustine continued to serve. The Brown County Democrat wrote about the men who served aboard the former yacht. They were still crammed aboard the aging St. Augustine, their hopes of being transferred to one of the many new escort ships being launched just never materialized. On the morning of January 6, 1944, St. Augustine left New York, escorting convoy NK 588, bound for Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. The convoy consisted of a single oil tanker and was escorted by the St. Augustine and two Coast Guard Thetis-class patrol vessels, U.S. Coast Guard cutter Argo and U.S. Coast Guard cutter Thetis. They left in a gale with winds of nearly 40 miles per hour, waves as high as 20 feet. St. Augustine was the command vessel for the convoy, captained by 47-year-old U.S. Naval Reserve Lieutenant Parker Crosby Hatch. On board also was 53-year-old Commander Archer Emmett King, Jr., a 1915 graduate of the United States Naval Academy. King was the commodore in overall command of the convoy. As per wartime regulations, the ships of the convoy were running darkened ship. All lights were either extinguished or covered, a precaution against U-boats. At about 10 that evening, the convoy escorts made radar contact with an unidentified vessel headed towards the convoy. Historian Jim Watkins writes in the Brown County Democrat, "At 10:20 p.m., off Cape May, New Jersey, the ship's radar man reported a new blip on his radar screen. Friend or foe?" The St. Augustine flashed its signal lights. The unrecognizable blip kept coming. The St. Augustine skipper turned across the invader's path to protect the convoy, and also with hopes the maneuver would divert the intruder. William H. Thiessen, historian at the Coast Guard Atlantic area, writes that lookouts aboard the cutter Argos could see the silhouettes of the vessels in the distance. Thiessen writes, "Within a few short minutes, Argos' officer of the day observed the bow of the 300-foot St. Augustine rise up out of the water at an odd angle and fall back into the water and disappear. Given the state of the stormy seas, he and the others on the bridge thought the escort had ridden up a large wave and dropped back into the accompanying trough. However, the men on Argos Bridge had actually witnessed the demise of the patrol gunboat." The unidentified vessel was the American liquefied natural gas tanker SS Camas Meadows. 502 feet long and over 10,000 gross registered tons, the Camas Meadows dwarfed the St. Augustine. She struck the gunboat amidship. Warren Harris, a yeoman second class from Danville, Ohio, was asleep below decks. He told the Mansfield, Ohio News-Journal in 1984 that he was awakened by the cryptic message, "Stand by for collision." Harris said that he hit the floor and muttered a prayer, "Lord, it's up to you." As the tanker ripped into the St. Augustine, "I could have reached out and touched the dumb thing," Harris said. Steaming unescorted out of Delaware Bay under blackout conditions, Thiessen writes that the master of the tanker had taken ill to his cabin, leaving the third mate to serve as officer of the deck, or OOD. The ship had a green crew, and no one on the bridge knew how to send or receive blinker signals. Thiessen writes that miles away from the scene of the disaster, Argos' officer of the day asked his radio man if he still had St. Augustine on the screen. The radio man indicated he no longer had a contact for the patrol gunboat. Coast Guard cutter Thetis tried to raise the St. Augustine by voice radio with no success, so Argos' officer of the day tried to contact the vessel by their talk-between-ships system. Argos' OOD feared the worst, called Captain Winslow of the Thetis for assistance, and ordered Argos' crew to general quarters. The News-Journal writes that the gunboat sank within 3 minutes as Harris and his mates hit the water wearing their oversized Mae West life jackets that had small red lights. At first, Harris recalls scores of small red lights from the Mae West jackets could be seen sighting across the Atlantic waters. Within a few minutes, however, Harris was all alone. The Brown County Democrat writes that some life rafts were deployed, but the ship sank so quickly that only a few were available, and they were overcrowded, with some sailors clinging to the sides. The Miami, Florida News wrote 3 days after the accident, survivors told of young sailors swimming off into the darkness to almost certain death to leave room on crowded rafts for their fellows who could not swim. The waves are so high the boats often disappeared from sight from each other. A.F. Frizzle, an 18-year-old seaman second class from Chicago, told of watching his buddy drown after he gave his life preserver to another injured sailor. 18-year-old seaman second class Stanley Matecki told the Philadelphia Inquirer that the St. Augustine took on water after the crash and then plunged straight down within a short while after the order was given to abandon ship. Matecki credited one of the coasties, 18-year-old Roscoe Jones of the Argo, for saving his life. I had been in the water some time, holding onto the ropes of a life raft, but finally lost my grip and went down. Just then the rescue ship came up, and Jones dived in, managed to collar me and haul me back to the vessel. Thiessen writes that the Camos Meadows came to a stop and turned on all of its running lights, an act prohibited during wartime in U-boat-infested waters. Argos headed for the tanker using signal lights to ask what happened. After several queries, the tanker blinked back, "Survivors, to the left of you." Argos had to steam through heavy seas to reach the location of the accident. The News Journal reports that for 2 hours, Harris bobbed up and down like a cork as the wind-blown waves reached up to 30 feet high. He felt his body slowly getting numb in the bone-chilling waters. He kept swimming, but thought the end might be near. The next thing I saw was a faint light sweeping over the ocean, and it fixed on a raft. How I got over to the raft, I have no idea. I put my arm through the rope, and that's the last thing I remember. Harris said that all of the ship's crew had escaped the sinking ship, but most died before the rescue ships came to the scene. One doctor took me aside, he said. He wanted me to explain what happened from beginning to end. According to the temperature of the water and the time of year, I wasn't supposed to be alive. The Brown County Democrat recalled Brown County resident Homer Allen Powell, just 19 years old. Powell had 2 brothers also serving in the Navy. A gunner's mate, 3rd class, the Democrat speculates that Powell would have been at his battle station on deck when the accident happened. The paper continues. There were 30 survivors, but Hummer was among those without a raft and could not have survived more than a short time in the cold Atlantic waters. There were 115 fatalities. Word of his death reached his parents the next week. The Brown County Democrat reported the Navy's description of Homer Powell. He was a quiet and friendly young man. His was a character of steadfastness and friendly loyalty. He was held in high esteem by his shipmates and his superior officers. Also missing was Roanoke, Virginia native Roy W. Carter. The Roanoke World News reported on January 26, 1944, that the wife of the seaman second class had been notified that he had been missing since the ship sank. In 1998, the Roanoke Times reported that one of the survivors told Carter's widow that he saw the mast fall, hitting Carter on the head. His body was never recovered. In 1944, the Times quoted his widow, Lois. Roy was handsome, happy-go-lucky, and loved life. He loved working for the railroad. He loved to play his guitar and sing. Also missing was Lee Ed Anderton, a signalman second class, age 20. The Florence, Alabama Herald reported on June 2nd that his father, the Reverend Lee Anderson, had received a telegram from the Navy Department. It is with regret, you are now advised, that a certificate of death has been received in this bureau, which states that your son lost his life on January 7th. Although his body was not recovered, the Judge Advocate General of the Navy, in reviewing the available evidence, has held that the circumstances surrounding his loss lead to a conclusion of death. Anderton had enlisted just after Pearl Harbor on December 19th, 1941. Of the crew of 145, 30 were rescued, 23 by the Argo and 7 by the Thetis. 76 bodies were recovered. The rest were lost at sea, including the skipper, Parker Crosby Hatch, married with 3 daughters. The website Line of Duty reported that survivors have told us of his unselfish and heroic work in saving the lives of others when he might have escaped with his own. His classmates at Princeton University wrote to his widow, "If there is any compensation for such things, it may perhaps be found in the fact that the skipper was serving the country he loved, in the way he loved, at sea." It is unclear exactly what happened in the last moments, especially why the St. Augustine decided to turn into the freighter's path. Harris noted that all of the boat's commanding officers were killed, so it's unknown exactly why the gunboat and the tanker collided. Much of what happened was kept secret due to wartime restrictions. Historian Mays Gray noted in a July 2000 edition of the Tallahassee, Florida Democrat that his second cousin, Osley Lee Scarborough, died on the St. Augustine. He writes, when Scarborough's ship went down, the Navy sent an officer to tell his family, but it was wartime. The officer could give no details of the accident. The family heard rumors that the ship was torpedoed, There were no survivors. He continues, several newspapers carried articles about the accident, but offered no insight into its cause. A joint Navy Coast Guard investigation was conducted, but the records were reportedly lost in a 1970s fire at the Navy's records warehouse. The story of the sinking of the USS St Augustine, like many things during the Second World War, is incomplete. Essential information is lost to history. The loss of what was once one of the world's most elegant yachts is a reminder of the dangers faced by service members everywhere. Their job was just as important as the fight. They kept the supply lines opened, Gray argues. Here are 115 men who died for their country. Shouldn't their sacrifice be recognized? I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.